In September 1999, Russia was hit by a series of explosions that seemed to come without warning. Apartment buildings were destroyed in the middle of the night. Families were killed while they slept. Within less than 2 weeks, explosions in other cities, including Moscow, killed almost 300 people and injured many more. The attacks created panic across the country. Residents began taking turns guarding apartment entrances. Suspicious cars and packages were reported to the police. In Moscow, identity checks and security searches became increasingly common. Russian authorities blamed Islamic militants linked to the conflict in Chechnya and the wider region. The bombings occurred at the same time that Russia was already confronting armed militants in Dagestan and moving towards a renewed war in Chechnya. They also happened just as a relatively unknown prime minister named Vladimir Putin was emerging as one of the most important figures in Russian politics. But then something happened in the city of Ryazan. Police apparently discovered another bomb inside an apartment building. Of course, residents were evacuated. A terrorism investigation began. And then 2 days later, the Federal Security Services announced that there had been no bomb. It had all been a training exercise. That explanation would transform the story of the apartment bombings from a national tragedy to one of the most controversial mysteries in modern Russian history. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. Russia at the end of the 1990s was a very different place than today. The country was still struggling with the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union. President Boris Yeltsin was deeply unpopular. Russia had suffered a major financial crisis in 1998, and political authority often appeared uncertain. Chechnya remained especially unstable. Russia had fought a devastating war against separatists there between 1994 and 1996. Russian forces eventually withdrew after failing to defeat the rebellion, leaving Chechnya largely outside Moscow's effective control. But the region did not become peaceful. Kidnapping, organized crime, and increasingly radical Islamist armed groups became serious problems. Then in August 1999, fighters crossed from Chechnya into neighboring Dagestan. They hoped to encourage an Islamic uprising against Russian rule. Instead, Russian forces responded. On August the 9th, President Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin as prime minister. Putin was not completely unknown within government circles. He had served as the director of the Federal Security Service, or FSB, from July 1998 until August 1999. But nationally, he had still a relatively low public profile. Within a few weeks, this would change. The first major apartment bombing came on September the 4th, 1999. A truck containing explosives detonated beside an apartment building in Bryansk, a military town in Dagestan. The building housed Russian military personnel and their families. 62 people were killed and many more were injured. Because fighting was already taking place in Dagestan, the attack appeared to fit within the escalating conflict in the region. But 5 days later, the violence reached Moscow. Shortly before midnight on September the 8th, a powerful explosion tore through an apartment building in Guryanov Street in the southeast of the Russian capital. Part of the 9-story building collapsed. More than 90 people were killed. Rescue workers searched through enormous piles of concrete and twisted metal. For residents of Moscow, the attack created a frightening new possibility. If an apartment block could be destroyed without warning, almost anyone could become a target. And before the country had recovered, Moscow was struck again. At around 5 o'clock in the morning of September the 13th, an explosion destroyed another apartment building in southern Moscow. This building was almost completely flattened. More than 100 people were killed. Russia was now facing what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of mass terrorism. Security measures intensified, basements were searched, residents formed informal patrols and watched entrances through the night. Police inspected suspicious vehicles and questioned people believed to have entered residential buildings without permission. Fear also produced serious abuses. Human Rights Watch reported that Moscow police detained around 20,000 people described as non-Muscovites during the security operations that followed. Ethnic Chechens especially were vulnerable to identity checks, detention, harassment, and even violence. Russian officials increasingly linked the bombings to militants from that region. Prime Minister Putin adopted an uncompromising public position and promised that those responsible would be hunted down. And then another Russian city was hit. Early on September the 16th, a truck exploded outside an apartment block in Volgodonsk in southern Russia. 17 people were killed and hundreds were injured. Windows shattered nearby in the surrounding area, and nearby buildings were damaged. Once again, emergency workers searched through the wreckage while shocked residents gathered outside their homes. Across the major apartment bombings of September 1999, almost 300 people were killed. These attacks had unfolded over less than 2 weeks, yet there had been no clear and convincing public claim of responsibility from the principal Chechen separatist leadership. Russian investigators would eventually conclude that the bombings had been organized by Islamist militants. Several people were later convicted, others were killed or remained fugitives. But before these investigations had reached their conclusions, an event took place that would permanently complicate the story. It happened in Ryazan. On the evening of September 22, residents of an apartment building in Ryazan, around 180 kilometers southeast of Moscow, noted suspicious activity near their building. Police were called. Inside the basement, officers found several sacks together with what appeared to be a detonating device and a timer. The residents were evacuated, and the local authorities treated the discovery as a genuine attempted terrorist attack. A criminal investigation was opened, and police began searching for suspects. Local police also reported that an initial test indicated the presence of hexogen, also known as RDX, which is a powerful military explosive. At first, the incident appeared to be another narrowly prevented apartment building. Then, suddenly, the official explanation changed. On September the 24th, FSB Director Nikolai Petrushev announced that there had never been a real explosive device. According to the FSB, the sacks contained sugar. The incident, he said, had been a security training exercise designed to test the response of residents and local authorities during the nationwide terrorism alert. That explanation immediately raised questions. Why had the local police apparently not known that an exercise was taking place? Why had a terrorism investigation been opened? Why had an initial test reportedly indicate explosives? And why conduct such an exercise inside an occupied residential building only days after hundreds of people had been killed in similar circumstances? The FSB maintained that the explanation was straightforward. For critics, this became the point at which the official story began to look far more complicated. Russian prosecutors eventually presented an official account of the bombings. According to their investigation, the attacks were organized by Islamic militants associated with Kataib and other radical networks operating in the Chechen region. Investigators said a group led by Akamez Gochiev helped arrange locations used to store or place explosives. Several suspects were prosecuted. In 2004, 2 people were sentenced to life imprisonment for their involvement in the Moscow and other bombings. The official investigation therefore presented the bombings as part of a wider campaign connected to Islamic militancy in the North Caucasus. That interpretation was not without context. Of course, Islamists had already invaded Dagestan. Armed Islamist networks were operating in the region. Russia was facing groups capable of carrying out major attacks. Yet the Ryazan incident ensured doubts about the investigation that did not disappear. Instead, those doubts gradually developed into a much more serious allegation. The most controversial alternative theory claimed that members of the Russian security services had themselves organized the apartment bombings. One of the most prominent supporters of this theory was former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko. Together with historian Yuri Felstinsky, he argued that the bombings had been a false flag operation intended to create fear, justify a renewed war in Chechnya, and help strengthen Vladimir Putin politically. It was an extraordinary accusation. It has never been conclusively proven. Russian authorities have repeatedly rejected it. Russian courts convicted Islamic militants for involvement in the attacks, and the official investigation attributed the bombings to extremist networks. Critics, however, continue to point towards Ryazan. They also questioned inconsistencies in early official statements. access to evidence, and the failure of attempts to establish an independent investigation capable of satisfying skeptics. Some critics additionally pointed towards the political consequences of the crisis. When Putin became Prime Minister in August 1999, he was still relatively unfamiliar to much of the Russian population. His forceful response to terrorism and the escalating conflict in Chechnya helped establish his reputation as a decisive political leader. By the end of the year, his position had changed dramatically. On December 31, 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigned. Putin became acting president. In March 2000, he won the presidential election. The apartment bombings did not by themselves create Putin's rise, but they formed part of the extraordinary political and security crisis during that which the rise took place. That timing has continued to encourage suspicion. It would be misleading to say that the apartment bombings alone caused the Second Chechen War. The conflict was already escalating before the first apartment building was destroyed. Islamist forces had entered Dagestan in August, and Russian forces were already fighting their militants. But the September bombings changed the atmosphere dramatically. They strengthened public fears of terrorism and helped create support for a much wider military action. By late September, Russian forces were conducting major air attacks against Chechnya. The conflict was now expanding into what became known as the Second Chechen War. Unlike the uncertain campaign of the mid-1990s, the new operation was presented by Moscow as both a struggle against terrorism and an attempt to restore federal authority. For many Russians traumatized by the apartment bombings, that argument was powerful. Putin's political identity became increasingly linked to the campaign. Russian forces eventually captured Grozny and restored federal control over much of Chechnya. But the fighting continued for years. The conflict involved insurgency, terrorism, and serious human rights abuses committed by Russian forces and armed groups. Meanwhile, Russia's political landscape was changing. The country that entered September 1999 under the increasingly fragile presidency of Boris Yeltsin would enter a new century under Vladimir Putin. More than 25 years later, discussion of the apartment bombings remains difficult because two separate questions are frequently confused. The first concerns what the Russian investigation concluded. Its answer was that Islamist militants associated organized the bombings. People were prosecuted and convicted on that basis. The second question is whether the investigation answered every legitimate concern surrounding the attacks, particularly the incident in Ryazan. That is much more disputed. The basic sequence of events in Ryazan is well documented. Suspicious sacks and a timing device were discovered in the basement. Residents were evacuated, and police initially treated the incident as an attempted bombing. An early test was reported to have indicated explosives. The FSB then announced that the sacks contained sugar and that the entire episode had just been an exercise. What cannot responsibly be stated as established historical fact is that the Ryazan incident proves that the FSB carried out the genuine apartment bombings. The publicly available evidence had never been conclusively demonstrated, but the unusual circumstances of Ryazan combined with the continuing arguments over the investigation have ensured that the alternative theory had never disappeared. For historians, that distinction is essential. Suspicion is not proved, but unresolved questions remain part of the historical record. The apartment bombings of September 1999 killed ordinary people inside their own homes. The human reality can easily be overshadowed by the political controversy that followed. For those living in the buildings, the attacks were not primarily about elections, intelligence agencies, or geopolitical strategy. They were acts of mass killings carried out by people as they slept. Their wider consequences, however, were enormous. The bombings created fear throughout Russia. They contributed to discrimination and serious abuses against Chechens and other people from that region. They strengthened public support for aggressive action against militant groups and became closely associated with the escalation of the Second Chechen War. They also took place during Vladimir Putin's rapid emergence as Russia's dominant political figure. The official investigation identified an Islamic militant network and resulted in convictions. The alternative theory accused elements of the Russian security services themselves. Between these two accounts sits Ryazan, a basement, several sacks, a time and an evacuation, and an explanation that many observers have never found convincing. The Russian apartment bombings therefore remain more than a story about terrorism in September 1999. They are a story about evidence, political power, and how difficult it can be to establish historical certainty when the institutions investigating an event are themselves accused of involvement. More than 25 years later, the controversy had never been conclusively resolved in the public record.